always a proud moment for a social worker to be able to do that. So wish me luck, and if someone could shout out if you're able to see my slides, that would be much appreciated. Are we able to see my slides? Are you okay with that? Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Fantastic. So if you've got any questions, any queries, any reflections, please put them in the chat, and Sandra will shout out at me from time to time when I'm able to take some calls. So my name is Tilia Lenz. I'm senior lecturer. I have produced these slides together with a colleague, Jenny Bigmore. Jenny unfortunately is not able to join us today, but I've taken some of her materials in here as well. So we talked about in-tune leadership and creating safe work communities and managing difference to really bring together the golden threads of today's presentation. So what do we mean with in-tune, and what is the meaning of it? So I've done the honourable thing and asked the dictionary, and I'll leave those quotes for you to have a look at. What really stood out for me by looking at the in-tune definitions was it is a state in which people agree or understand one another. And as a social worker, that's really the essence of all my practice, to come alongside someone. The other quote that stood out for me was that the new supervisor is not in tune with the needs of the staff. Now, I was a social work manager for 6 years, and I can certainly reflect now that at times I wasn't in tune with the needs of my staff because of the pressures around me, the pressures that I was experiencing, and I wasn't necessarily always able to give them the safety in their role that they needed to. So at that point, I probably became really interested in attachment theory and how we can apply attachment theory in the workplace, which is now part of my PhD research. And for those of you who've done research, you know you have to do a literature review, which I'm still in the middle of. And at some point I thought, gosh, this is really rather overwhelming. So I've given you here a little word cloud which pulls out the themes and some of the words that were just in the titles when I looked at attachment theory and its application in the workplace. So my research interest is around relationship-based performance management, and I'm really unpicking what does relationship mean within that workplace, and how can I increase the performance of staff, and what do I need to do as a leader? How can I achieve that? So I would like to take you on a little journey that I've been on and explain my understanding of attachment theory and maybe demystify it a little bit. Attachment theory apparently is one of the most used and quoted pieces of theory and research in social work practice, and is informing most of our decision making, certainly in children's social care, when we're looking at permanency planning for children, for example, and court processes. And it all started off with the thinking of Dr. John Bowlby, and part of my research has been to go to London to the Wellcome Trust Library to find his unpublished papers. And what you see here on the slides is some of his handwritten work. There are about 2,500 different files and folders with his handwriting. I've given you one with his probably best handwriting here. There were some that took a lot longer to decipher and were rather illegible. But his wife, who's written extensive letters to, has at some point forgiven him for his best handwriting, for his bad handwriting. So I'm taking a little bit of her hint that actually it's okay. So John Bowlby is seen as the father of attachment theory, and he started thinking about the importance of connections from the 1930s, which is quite evident in the letters that he wrote to his wife and other people around him. So I found myself at some point quite confused about the complexity of attachment theory and wondered why that is. And since the 1950s, when John Bowlby started writing and publishing about attachment theory, the whole theory has been applied in different settings, in various guises, and has been further developed. One of the main developers was his colleague Mary Ainsworth, which some of you are probably quite familiar with. And she had come up with the strange situation experiment and essentially started to really categorize attachment patterns or behaviors and so on and so forth. At some point, the rhetoric around attachment theory really changed, and my hypothesis is that Mary Ainsworth went back to the US, where she had come from originally, whilst John Bowlby stayed in the UK. And the terminology is very different, and my assumption is that because of their different cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds, the development of the terminology really changed. So that adds to the complexity within the literature, and some of it is really not that comparative. What I would like to talk to you about then is that actually was one of the reasons why I went back straight to Bowlby's original writings, because that complexity was a little bit too overwhelming and didn't quite fit into what I wanted to do with my PhD. So while sifting through all his letters, notes and manuscripts, I realized that I was starting to see Bowlby within his historical and cultural context. And from this, I can now look at the critiques and challenges of attachment theory in a different light. So some of the critique is around this was only applied to white middle class women and their children in particular. But actually that was the field of research Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby at the time were operating in. So we need to take that into account when we're now applying attachment theory in various guises and forms. However, John Bowlby himself hadn't looked at different attachment styles. For him, it was a different story, and I'd like to tell that story to you now. So he had taken 3 different parts, really, and from those parts of theory and thinking, he formed the theory. So he started off with ethology, and he observed the need to bond with others in animals and humans. And he had done quite a bit of collaboration with Konrad Lorenz, who had done some research on geese. And saw himself at times as a father of geese, and you may find some videos on the internet where families and flocks of geese are following him because he's the leader, even though he's not a goose. So this very much influenced John Bowlby's thinking. Why do we connect? Why do we bond? Why do we attach ourselves to someone else who's clearly in a leadership position? He was very much part of the scene around psychoanalysis, and you can see there the couch of Sigmund Freud. It's in the Sigmund Freud Museum in London, and he looked at the impact of trauma. So John Bowlby was very much interested in what does trauma do to our mind and to our mental health, and he saw that very much in the context of the First and Second World War and the Spanish flu, all of which influenced him during his childhood and his adolescence and then early adulthood. He also looked at cognitive psychology and how we develop our sense of self through the interaction with others and the mental models that we're forming of ourselves and others. So the question for me was, as a social worker, I had been told attachment theory is very much between the mother and the child. But looking at Bowlby's original writing, actually, that's not what he said. For him, attachment behaviour is any form of behaviour that results in a person attaining or maintaining proximity to some other clearly identified individual who is conceived to be better able to cope with the world. And this is most obvious when the person is frightened, fatigued, or sick. Now, from a managerial point of view, I can now see that in the context of leadership. I've had plenty of people that I thought proximity to when I felt wobbly, when I felt stressed, when I felt overworked and overwhelmed, frightened or anxious. I also realised that when I was a manager, I had staff, friends who sought my proximity and saw me as a leader and someone who was able to provide safety. So Bobby goes on to say that at times this kind of behaviour is less evident, and nevertheless, for a person to know that an attachment figure is available and responsive gives them a strong and pervasive feeling of security and encourages him to value and continue the relationship. So again, bringing that into the workplace, if we are able to form a responsive relationship with someone, as Anand said, if we are visible, if we are there for our staff, then that sense of security and that feeling of being valued within that relationship can only grow. And Bobby said very early on that attachment behaviour is most obvious in early childhood because that's where we are the most vulnerable, but it can be observed throughout the life cycle and especially in emergencies. Now, I know I'm talking to a lot of people here who are in frontline services who know that emergencies aren't just something that happens when we are little, but happens in our daily working life. If you're in frontline and you're managing a team that is dealing with other people's crises, other people's pain and trauma, then that is part of emergencies. So in my literature review, I then dived into the attachment theory application in the workplace. And there was one study that really stuck with me, and I think may be quite interesting for some of you to follow up. Davidovich have done some leader-follower research and compiled it in a research paper in 2007, but the research actually spans over several years. They've looked at the attachment styles in officers and soldiers in the Israeli army during combat training. Now, this was a very gendered study. They had mostly male participants, and all of them were under the age of 24. So even the officers, the leaders, the managers were at the early stages of their adulthood. The youngest participants were only 18 in their soldier training. So that as a caveat, what Davidovich and colleagues found that the officer's attachment style correlated directly with the soldier's mental health and performance. So the more the officer was able to provide a secure base, was available, approachable and responsive, the better the soldiers performed within the training, the combat training, and the better they were within their mental health. The other side of the coin is if the officer wasn't able to provide that secure base and wasn't able to rely on their inner resources to be secure within themselves, that had in turn the impact on the soldiers who then deteriorated in their mental health and didn't perform. And I guess taking that picture of the Israeli army in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, that is a very different cultural and socioeconomic context than what we're working in. It is taking attachment theory in the workplace into the most dangerous environment possibly, where it's been really unpicked and researched, but it shows that there are really direct correlations and there may be some learning that we can take forward. So, Sandra, are there any questions at this point? Or are we okay to go on?
No, that's fine. We're all up to date with the questions at the moment.
Fantastic, thank you. So, taking us back into our workplace settings, what I found is that the interplay between proximity seeking actions and behaviours and the manager's or educator's response offers us insights into personal connections and attunement. How can I come alongside someone? How can I be in tune so I can get the best and the most out of our students and out of staff? So by applying those basic principles of attachment theory, I was able to look at those parts. So how can we then create that safe space? How can I be in balance with my staff, with my students, to manage risks, which Anand referred to as risk takers. How can we explore our environment and really drive practice forward? How can we drive research forward? How can we take risks? But also, how can we make fair and sound decisions for those who we serve? In children's social care, providing a safe base, a safe working environment for staff means that actually social workers are able to make decisions from a place where they feel understood, where they can attach meaning to actions of families, so and so forth, rather than making rash decisions which will have lifelong consequences for the families that we work with. So, as I referred to earlier, there are certain categories that were identified by Mary Ainsworth and some of her followers, which really brought up some ethical issues for me around the application of attachment theory and attachment styles in the workplace. And I found some US research where it was suggested that social workers and other staff may be eligible, if that's the right word, for a test, for want of a better word, of their attachment styles, undergo that process to assess them, because apparently people who have a secure attachment style, whatever that means, would have higher performance and would stick to the job more, would have lower attrition rates. Now, for me, that is a real ethical issue, because I wouldn't want to consider that my childhood experiences or those of other people would determine what kind of role I can take in the future or what kind of job I can perform. And Bobby himself offers a really valuable counter argument there, and he shares that people can have relationship specific attachment styles. So even though you may as a child have had experiences where your primary caregiver wasn't available, wasn't responsive to your needs, and you may have a disorganized, avoidant or anxious attachment style, that doesn't mean that that will follow on in the future. Certainly as an adult, you can have a secure attachment to other people. That may be your partner, that may be your children, that may also be your manager, that may also be the organization that you work for. If we as managers and leaders and educators are able to provide that safe base, so our staff, students, and those around us want to follow us because we provide them with that safety, security and responsiveness in relationships. So I'm now looking at those relationship-specific attachments and really take that question to you: how can we do that? And why is it so important in the context of anti-racist practice? So this is really where Jenny Bigmore and I started to reflect upon, because we were sitting here, metaphorically, as white women, and we've never been strip searched. We've never been stopped walking down the road because of our ethnicity. And we started thinking about attachment theory and tuning in and coming alongside, having that shared understanding for each other's experiences in the context of equality, diversity and inclusion. And how can we provide a safe base for someone who has experiences that are probably quite different from ours? So I'd like to take you on that little journey around experiencing and witnessing racism as students and as members of staff in different organisations, and take you to a report that Jenny had pulled out. So the anti-racism report identified that 9% of the people that were involved in the study had experienced racism from colleagues and managers in the last 12 months. That is a significant number. That is a number of people who don't feel safe in their workplace, because if you're at the receiving end of racism, you don't feel safe, you don't feel welcomed. You're not part of something. And as leaders, managers and educators in health and social care settings, we are signed up to be non-oppressive. We want to work in an anti-racist way, and we want to provide safety for our staff, because if staff don't feel safe, the report found they leave. And for any worker or any student to leave their workplace or place of learning because of racism and oppression, that's detrimental, not just for the profession, but also for the people that we serve. So those numbers really shocked me in a way, yet they didn't come as a surprise. So what can we do then as organisations? We have a responsibility, and we need to move beyond just the mechanisms of reporting racism. We need to provide inclusive and safe working communities. There have been some examples, including at BU, of reverse mentoring and forums for Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff. We need to, I'm going to use the word normalise conversations around racism, so staff are able to say what they're experiencing, what they're witnessing. We need to enable our students, our colleagues to speak up, and we need to be able to speak up for them if need be, if we're witnessing racism or oppressive behaviours. And we need to acknowledge that there are issues around structural racism. And in order to break those structures, we need to address the lack of diversity at senior management level. And we need to be more inclusive. We need to be the activists, as Anand referred to. We need to be the risk takers. Otherwise, this may not necessarily change. We're responsible for the change. So how can we do that? Allyship is probably a term that's been used quite frequently now. And I'd like to unpick that for a few minutes with you. So what is it? Essentially, it's a process, and it means listening. Listening and acknowledging and appreciating the experiences of those who are at the receiving end of oppression and racism. A white ally acknowledges the limits of their knowledge. As a white person, as I said, I've not been strip searched. I could run down the road and I wouldn't be stopped, and I wouldn't be suspected of having, I don't know, done something just purely because of the colour of my skin or my appearance. But I need to acknowledge those are just my experiences, and other people have different experiences. And I need to be brave enough and be okay in that uncomfortable knowledge that other people have very different experiences, and those are experiences of feeling unsafe. So what can I do about it as a white ally? This lack of knowledge, this lack of experience in a sense, doesn't mean that I can be silent about it. It actually means I need to speak up, and I need to actively speak up. And I need to speak up for myself as a social worker, because it's part of my values. It's what I signed up for. But I also need to speak up for my colleagues, for my friends, for the students, and everyone who's around me. So how can we make organisations anti-racist? We've got actually quite a good legal framework there, the Equality Act, that's been around since 2010. And by showing a commitment as an organisation, committed to the relationship, bringing it back to Bowlby's attachment theory, we can create that safety. Commitment isn't just a tick box exercise and maybe a questionnaire that's sent around once a year or so. It isn't just to put on a staff forum, but then maybe not giving it any resources, and that includes staff time. Commitment means real commitment and showing up for what you've signed up. Co-creation, being able to listen to the voices of those with a lived experience, to co-create a work environment that feels safe, that is safe. Connecting, Anand spoke about being there as a manager, connecting with your staff group, communicating, learning and sharing the learning from and with each other, and being consistent in that approach. And with that, I'm going to leave you all with a little treasured letter that I found in the Freud Museum, where Anna Freud actually wrote a little letter to John Bowlby. And she shared in there, when she gave him some advice on the qualities of being a psychoanalyst. You have to have a great love for the truth, scientific as well as personal truth. And you have to place this appreciation of truth higher than any discomfort at meeting unpleasant facts, whether they belong to the world outside or to your own inner person. And with that, I'm hoping to give you some inspiration how you can create safe and inclusive work communities and how you can be an ally to those around you. Now, Sandra, are there any questions?
Yes, we've got a question from David. He wonders how the insights given by Davidovich, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, can be applicable to other contexts.
I'm quite happy to share the whole research paper. That's not a problem. There is an awful lot of knowledge and unpicking. So these are essentially 3 different studies in there, and they have made links within those studies to other work settings. I guess the greatest learning for me was just the significant evidence that the leaders' attachment style, but also behaviours within the workplace had such a direct impact on the followers, on the members of staff that they were looking after. So that was really my takeaway point, that essentially as a manager and leader, I need to, well, maybe get myself together and create a safe space around me so I can be that safe space for others. It starts with a leader. I don't know if that's answered it, but happy to elaborate more.
Yeah, Louise has asked, could you share the last statement you read from Anna Freud so she can unpick it further?
I'll put it in the chat during the break. That may be the easiest.
Thank you.
It's also on the slide that is probably still up. It's in the first paragraph, and the slides will be shared with everyone. Okay.
David has responded to your question, Tilia. He says, Tilia, the question you posed about the ability to listen is, in my view, requires people to have an understanding and capability of how to listen constructively. How can we do this?
Gosh, listening constructively, I guess that very much sits within the work context and the context of the relationship between the person who's being listened to and who we need to listen to. I don't think there's a straightforward answer other than maybe coming back to what Anna Freud has said, that we need to accept the truth, and the truth may not always be what we want to hear, but it is the lived experience of others, and the acceptance that others will have a different view of the world, different experiences, is certainly what I found when I've had to listen to some stories that weren't necessarily my experience, where I was challenged in accepting other people's truth. And that is an ongoing journey, and it's not always an easy one. But that's where I guess some of the research of the Centre for Seldom Heard Voices comes in, that we are wanting to listen to those voices that are seldom heard and to bring out those truths, but it's a hard task. Okay, right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.